Masculinity in gaming has always been a very complicated subject because video games often exaggerate strength, aggression, dominance, and power. For years, many male protagonists were often written as emotionless warriors whose only purpose was violence or revenge. Older games often treated masculinity as the absence of vulnerability, where men were expected to suppress emotion and solve every problem through force. This created characters who looked strong on the surface but lacked emotional depth. Toxic masculinity in gaming usually appears when male characters are portrayed as emotionally detached, cruel, reckless, or controlling, while the story frames those traits as admirable instead of destructive. It can also show up in the communities themselves, where some players believe masculinity means humiliating others, rejecting empathy, or treating weakness as shameful. In these cases, masculinity becomes tied to dominance rather than responsibility, or maturity, or emotional intelligence. Many games in the early 2000s and even into the 2010s were teaching young kids to lean into these toxic traits, to be aggressive and dominant, to only portray your emotions through anger, and as stupid as it may be to say, this 100% had an effect on the youth of that time. Teaching young impressionable children to lash out and show anger as their primary emotion, and have that be seen as something to be proud of or something that is considered to be cool by society. In this video, I would like to take a deep dive into masculinity in video games. When it's done right, when it's done wrong, and everything in between. For an entire generation of young boys growing up in the 2000s and early 2010s, video games became more than just entertainment. They became a blueprint for what masculinity was supposed to look like. The heroes dominating the screens during that era were often angry, emotionally detached men who solved every problem through violence, intimidation, or dominance. Strength was measured by how ruthless you could be, how emotionless you could act, and how much destruction you could cause. Vulnerability was treated as weakness. Compassion was rarely rewarded, and in many ways, gaming culture at the time reflected a broader cultural belief that real men were supposed to suppress their emotions, avoid sensitivity, and always appear powerful no matter what cost. For young players, these characters were influential because games are uniquely immersive compared to movies or television. Players were not just watching these masculine ideals, they were embodying them. They stepped into the role of soldiers, criminals, anti-heroes, and warriors who were often praised for aggression rather than emotional maturity. Franchises like Grand Theft Auto, Gears of War, and the original God of War trilogy helped popularize an image of masculinity built around anger, dominance, and emotional isolation. Online gaming culture amplified this even further, where trash talk and humiliation and hostility became normalized as a sign of confidence or strength. Many young boys learned early that showing emotion could make you a target, while aggression earned respect. Now, I don't think that trash talk in video games is necessarily that bad of a thing. I definitely do it myself in online games, but it definitely perpetuates that sort of alpha male mindset that a lot of people tend to have nowadays, and I think that's kind of where it all stemmed from. The problem was never that the games featured violence or tough male characters. The problem was that many games failed to balance those traits with emotional depth or accountability or humanity. Young audiences were repeatedly exposed to protagonists who rarely communicated openly, rarely processed trauma in healthy ways, and rarely showed vulnerability unless it immediately transformed into rage. Over time, this created a narrow and often damaging idea of masculinity, that being a man meant being emotionally closed off, dominant, and feared. For many kids growing up during that era, gaming unintentionally reinforced the idea that masculinity was something performative, a constant need to appear strong no matter how much pain existed underneath the surface. Now, to be clear, I am not insinuating that all characters from this time frame of video games struggled from toxic masculinity, and I am not saying that even some of the hardest or toughest characters were purely evil because of their inability to feel. But what I am saying is the time frame reflected a much bigger issue in the world, that being of men showing emotions. An issue that is still prevalent to this day, and an issue I think should be talked about in an open dialogue. The perpetuation of hypermasculinity has been an issue in the world for some time now, and especially still today. It is weak to show emotion. It is weak to cry or to tell people you're not doing okay. This was shown very often in the video game industry and almost in a way further reinforced to be that way when you, as a young and impressionable child, see your favorite gaming characters acting as such. Like I said earlier, I'm not saying all tough-ass characters had no redeeming qualities, all because they were hyper-masculine, because some of them did. I just kind of want to point that out before getting into some of the culprits from differing games. So without further ado, let's get into some of the big offenders from this time. So once again, to reiterate my point, toxic masculinity in gaming is often portrayed through characters who believe power, violence, and dominance, or emotional suppression, are the only ways to prove manhood. These characters are not necessarily badly written because sometimes games intentionally use them to criticize these behaviors. The difference lies in if the game glorifies these behaviors or examines its consequences. Some games intentionally present toxic masculinity as destructive, while others unintentionally celebrate it without much reflection. The Greek saga version of Kratos is one of the most iconic examples of toxic masculinity in gaming because nearly every aspect of his identity is built around rage, domination, emotional suppression, and revenge. Throughout games like God of War 2 and God of War 3, Kratos is portrayed as less than human and more as a weapon fueled entirely by rage. His grief, guilt, and trauma around his wife and child being killed are never processed in healthy ways, but instead, every emotion is converted into violence. The games glorify this transformation constantly. Kratos becomes more powerful, the angrier he becomes, and the player is rewarded for increasingly brutal acts of destruction. The Greek games rarely slow down to examine the emotional consequences of his actions, because the spectacle itself is the focus. Violence is presented as empowerment, and emotional vulnerability is almost non-existent. This creates a version of masculinity where pain is not something to confront honestly, but something to bury beneath aggression and dominance. What makes Greek-era Kratos especially important to analyze is how strongly he reflected the masculine power fantasies common in the early 2000s. He represented the idea that masculinity meant being unstoppable, being feared, and emotionally invulnerable. Kratos almost never communicates openly about his trauma in meaningful ways because the games define his strength through destruction rather than healing. Even moments of tragedy are framed primarily as motivation for his revenge. His masculinity is entirely reactive and externalized. He cannot process emotion internally, so he projects it outward onto the world through brutality. Young players growing up during this era were repeatedly exposed to the idea that masculine suffering should transform into rage instead of reflection. This is exactly why the Norse-era reinvention of Kratos became so impactful years later. The newer games effectively critique the older version by showing the emotional emptiness and destruction his former mindset created. But more on that later. Marcus Phoenix from Gears of War embodies another major form of toxic masculinity that dominated gaming culture during the late 2000s, that being emotional hardening through militarized masculinity. Marcus exists in a world where vulnerability is almost completely absent. The entire visual design of Gears of War emphasizes exaggerated masculine toughness. Massive armored bodies, gravelly voices, constant warfare, and relentless aggression. Marcus himself rarely expresses emotion beyond anger, frustration, or grim determination. Pain and trauma are treated as things soldiers silently endure rather than openly discuss. The game frames emotional stoicism as heroic, reinforcing the idea that real men survive hardships by suppressing emotions instead of processing it. Marcus is constantly isolated emotionally, and his value as a man is measured primarily through physical resilience and his combat effectiveness. The deeper issue with Marcus Phoenix and the Gears of War games in general is that the games rarely challenge this worldview. His emotional repression is not portrayed as unhealthy or tragic in any way. The player is encouraged to admire how hardened and emotionally unaffected he appears despite the horrors surrounding him. This reflects a broader cultural idea common during that period of gaming. Masculinity was often tied directly to emotional silence. Men were expected to carry pain privately while projecting strength outwardly at all times. For younger audiences, characters like Marcus reinforce the belief that expressing fear, sadness, or vulnerability could undermine masculinity itself. Even the relationships between characters in Gears of War are usually filtered through aggression, sarcasm, or combat rather than emotional honesty. The result is a version of masculinity that glorifies endurance and toughness while neglecting emotional health entirely. Duke Nukem is perhaps one of the clearest examples of gaming directly glorifying exaggerated toxic masculinity as entertainment. In games like Duke Nukem Forever, Duke is portrayed as the ultimate male fantasy. Hyper-aggressive, arrogant, sexually objectifying, emotionally shallow, and obsessed with dominance. Everything about his personality revolves around providing superiority over others. He constantly mocks people around him, treats women as objects for validation, and presents emotional vulnerability as weakness. Unlike some modern games that critique these behaviors, Duke Nukem largely celebrates them. The character of Duke Nukem is intentionally designed to appear cool because of his excessiveness. His confidence, aggression, and lack of empathy are framed as entertaining strengths rather than flaws. What makes Duke Nukem especially significant is how strongly he reflects older cultural ideas about masculinity from the 1990s and early 2000s. Character embodies a fantasy where masculinity is defined entirely through ego, dominance, and sexual conquest. There's almost no emotional depth behind the surface because emotional complexity would interfere with the fantasy that the games are selling. Duke never needs to grow, self-reflect, or confront consequences in meaningful ways because the games reward him for remaining exactly the same. This creates a shallow but influential image of masculinity where men gain value through intimidation, mockery, and constant displays of superiority over others. For younger audiences exposed to these portrayals repeatedly, it normalizes the idea that masculinity is meant to always appear as untouchable or emotionally detached and socially dominant. Trevor Phillips from GTA 5 represents more chaotic and psychologically unstable version of toxic masculinity. Trevor is driven almost entirely by impulse, aggression, and the need for control. He uses violence to assert dominance constantly and reacts to emotional discomfort with explosive anger. Unlike healthier masculine characters who regulate emotions responsibly, Trevor externalizes every feeling through intimidation and destruction. He demands loyalty while simultaneously terrorizing the people closest to him. His masculinity is built around unpredictability and fear, creating the illusion that power comes from making others feel unsafe. Throughout the game, Trevor often treats empathy or emotional sensitivity as weakness, relying instead on aggression to maintain control over situations and relationships. What makes Trevor particularly interesting is that GTA 5 partially uses this as satire, while still making him entertaining and empowering to play. The game exaggerates his behavior to absurd levels, but it also rewards players for embracing his chaos. Trevor becomes symbolic of a broader issue in gaming culture where destructive, masculine traits can be simultaneously criticized as well as glamorized. He reflects a type of masculinity rooted in emotional instability, dominance, and rejection of restraint. Underneath his regression is a deeply insecure and emotionally damaged person, but the game often prioritizes shock value and entertainment over fully exploring that. For many players, Trevor became memorable because of how fearless and uninhibited he appeared, reinforcing the idea that masculinity is tied to recklessness and emotional validity rather than maturity or self-control. As gaming has evolved, so has its portrayal of masculinity. Many modern developers have started to recognize that strength alone does not make a compelling male character, and that emotional depth can be just as powerful as physical dominance. The industry slowly began moving away from the hyper-aggressive power fantasies that defined so much of the 2000s, and instead started exploring masculinity through vulnerability, responsibility, and emotional growth. Rather than portraying men as emotionless warriors who solve every problem through violence, newer games began asking more difficult questions. What happens when a man is forced to confront his trauma instead of burying it? What does strength look like outside of domination and aggression? Can a masculine character still be powerful while also being compassionate, patient, and emotionally open? These questions led to some of the most emotionally complex protagonists gaming has ever seen. The Norse-era version of Kratos in God of War Ragnarok and God of War 2018 represents one of the most significant evolutions of masculinity ever portrayed in gaming. Unlike the Greek-era Kratos, who defined himself entirely through rage and vengeance, the Norse games portray a man desperately trying to break free from the cycle of violence that once consumed him. Kratos is still physically powerful and intimidating, but the games no longer frame aggression as his defining trait. Instead, his greatest struggle becomes emotional restraint and fatherhood. He fears passing his anger and trauma on to Atreus, and much of the emotional tension in the story comes from Kratos attempting to communicate love and wisdom despite not knowing how to express those feelings properly. His masculinity is rooted in responsibility and protection rather than dominance. What makes Norse Kratos such a powerful example of positive masculinity is that the games portray emotional growth as a form of strength. Kratos learns patience, empathy, and vulnerability over time, even though those traits are deeply uncomfortable for him. The emotional weight of his character comes from watching someone raised in violence slowly realize that the true strength is not about overpowering others, but about controlling yourself. He openly acknowledges his mistakes, admits his failures as a father, and actively tries to become better. The game also rejects the idea that masculinity requires emotional silence. Some of the strongest scenes involve Kratos speaking honestly with Atreus, expressing fear about losing him or trying to teach him wisdom rather than aggression. The Norse games effectively redefine Kratos as a symbol of toxic masculinity into a symbol of emotional maturity and self-control. He remains masculine, powerful, and respected, but those qualities are now balanced with compassion and introspection. What makes the Norse-era Kratos such an important example of positive masculinity is not simply that he becomes nicer or calmer than he was in the Greek games. It is the fact that the newer games portray masculinity as discipline, wisdom, and emotional responsibility rather than domination. Kratos understands better than anyone else what unchecked anger can do to a person because he already lived through it. Every interaction he has with Atreus is shaped by the fear that his son could inherit some of his destructive tendencies that ruined his own life. This changes the entire foundation of his character. In the older games, Kratos used violence as a way to regain control over his suffering. In the Norse games, he constantly questions whether violence is necessary at all. The conflict is no longer about conquering enemies, but about breaking cycles of pain and teaching the next generation to become something better. One of the most important aspects of Kratos' masculinity is his restraint. Modern culture often portrays strength as being able to overpower others physically or emotionally, but the Norse games repeatedly suggest that self-control is the highest form of power. Kratos is still one of the most dangerous beings in the world, yet many of the most meaningful moments come from the times he chooses not to unleash that violence. He carefully controls his emotions around Atreus because he understands how easily anger can shape a child's understanding of manhood. This creates a version of masculinity rooted in responsibility. Kratos recognizes that being a father is not about controlling his son through fear or authority, but by guiding him with patience and example. Even when Atreus disobeys him or acts impulsively, which he does a lot, Kratos increasingly responds through teaching rather than intimidation. Another reason that Kratos shows so much positive masculinity is the way the games portray emotional effort. Emotional openness does not come naturally to him. He struggles constantly to communicate affection, comfort, or vulnerability because he spent most of his life believing emotions only led to suffering. What makes his character powerful is that he tries anyway. Small moments, placing a hand on Atreus' shoulder, listening instead of commanding, admitting uncertainty, or attempting to comfort someone grieving carry enormous emotional weight because the audience understands how difficult those actions are for him. The games frame emotional growth as active work rather than passive transformation. Kratos is not magically healed from his past. He consciously chooses every day to become better. That idea is central to positive masculinity because it represents manhood not as something proven through power, but as something shaped through accountability and self-improvement. Kratos also challenges the older masculine idea that fathers must remain emotionally distant to appear strong to their kids. One of the core themes of the Norse games is learning how to love openly despite fear of loss. Kratos initially keeps Atreus at an emotional distance because he believes attachment creates weakness and pain. However, over time, he realizes that emotional distance is actually preventing him from becoming the father his son needs. His journey becomes about learning how to express care rather than simply provide protection. This is especially important because the games never portray tenderness as making Kratos less masculine. He remains respected, feared, and incredibly powerful throughout the story, but his greatest victories are emotional rather than physical. The audience watches a man who once destroyed entire worlds out of rage slowly learn how to trust, guide, and care for others without violence. The Norse games also portray wisdom as a masculine strength. Older action games often glorified impulsiveness and aggression, where male heroes prove themselves through recklessness or brute force. Kratos, however, constantly emphasizes caution, reflection, and understanding consequences. He teaches Atreus to think before acting and repeatedly warns him about the dangers of arrogance and vengeance. This creates a very different image of masculinity from the hyper-aggressive heroes that dominated gaming in the early decades. Kratos is still stoic and physically imposing, but his defining qualities are now patience, humility, and emotional maturity. The game suggests that masculinity is strong, not when it seeks power over others, but when it seeks mastery over oneself. Sam Porter Bridges from Death Stranding presents an entirely different and more unconventional form of masculinity. Sam is not driven by dominance, revenge, or conquest. Instead, his story revolves around connection, empathy, and emotional isolation. At the beginning of the game, Sam is deeply withdrawn from other people, emotionally closed off due to trauma and loss. However, unlike many older masculine protagonists who express trauma through rage or violence, Sam internalizes his pain through loneliness and emotional distance. The core theme of Death Stranding is rebuilding human connection in a fractured world, and Sam's masculinity is tied directly to his ability to reconnect emotionally with others, rather than dominate them physically. What makes Sam such an important masculine character is that the game frames emotional sensitivity and care as heroic traits. His journey is not just about becoming more violent or more powerful, but about learning to trust people, build relationships, and carry emotional burdens together instead of alone. Even the gameplay reinforces this idea because the player spends most of the game delivering supplies and reconnecting communities rather than simply killing enemies. Sam's strength comes from endurance, compassion, and persistence rather than aggression. He represents a major shift in gaming masculinity because he shows that men do not need to be emotionally invulnerable or dominant to be heroic. Death Stranding treats empathy, cooperation, and emotional openness as strengths rather than weaknesses, offering one of the most unique portrayals of masculinity in modern gaming. Nathan Drake from Uncharted 4: A Thief's End is another excellent example of healthier masculinity because he balances confidence and competence with emotional sincerity and vulnerability. Nathan still fits many traditional masculine adventurer heroes' traits. He's brave, charismatic, physically capable, and witty under pressure. However, unlike older action protagonists who were emotionally detached, Nathan's relationships are central to his identity. His marriage to Elena, his complicated bond with his brother Sam, and his fear of losing the people he loves all play major roles in the story. Nathan is not afraid to express affection, regret, fear, or emotional conflict, which makes him feel more human than older game protagonists. Nathan Drake's masculinity is especially effective because the game allows him to fail emotionally. He lies, makes selfish decisions, and struggles with balancing adventure and responsibilities. But the game's story does not glorify these flaws. Instead, Uncharted 4 focuses heavily on emotional accountability and maturity. Nathan eventually realizes that constantly chasing danger and excitement is damaging the relationships that truly matter to him. Unlike toxic masculine characters who prioritize ego and dominance above anything else, Nathan ultimately chooses emotional honesty and connection. His story suggests that masculinity is not about becoming an unstoppable action hero, but about understanding your responsibilities to the people that you care about. Nathan Drake feels like a modern evolution of the classic action protagonist because he retains confidence and courage while also embracing emotional vulnerability and personal growth. And now, the inspiration for this video in the first place: the best character ever created in video game history, one of the most emotionally complex and amazingly written characters ever, and someone that all men, or women even, should model themselves after: Arthur Morgan. Arthur Morgan from Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of the strongest examples of positive masculinity in modern gaming because his character arc is centered around emotional growth, accountability, and compassion rather than dominance. At the beginning of the game, Arthur fits many traditional masculine archetypes. He's physically intimidating, emotionally guarded, highly capable in violence, and loyal to his gang above all else. However, what makes Arthur different from older masculine protagonists is that the story forces him to reflect on the emotional consequences of his lifestyle. As he becomes increasingly aware of the destruction caused by Dutch's ideology and the violence surrounding him, Arthur begins questioning the very identity he built his entire life around. Instead of doubling down on the aggression and pride, he slowly becomes more empathetic, self-aware, and emotionally honest. His masculinity is no longer defined purely by strength or survival, but by willingness to help others, even when there is nothing to gain personally. Arthur's growth is especially powerful because the game never portrays vulnerability as weakness. Some of the most important moments in Red Dead 2 involve quiet conversations, emotional honesty, and acts of compassion rather than action or violence. Like I stated previously, throughout most of the game, Arthur is seen as the stereotypical outlaw. Tough, intimidating, emotionally guarded, and capable of extreme violence. He rarely opens himself up emotionally to other people, especially in a direct or vulnerable way. But one exception is towards the end of the game, when he speaks to Sister Calderon. The performance of masculinity he's carried for years begins to break down. For perhaps the first time in Arthur's life, he allows himself to be honest about his fear, guilt, and emotional exhaustion without masking those feelings behind anger or aggression. The most important moment comes during the train station conversation near the end of the game, when Arthur quietly admits, "I'm afraid."
What's wrong?
I'm dying, sister.
Okay.
Yeah, I got TB. I got it. Beating a man to death for a few bucks. I've lived a bad life, sister.
We've all lived bad lives, Mr. Morgan. We all sin. But I know you.
You don't know me.
Forgive me, but that's the problem. You don't know you.
What do you mean?
I don't know, but whenever we happen to meet, you're always helping people and smiling.
I had a son. He passed away. I had a girl who loved me. I threw that away. My mama died when I was a kid. And my daddy, well, I watched him die. And it weren't soon enough.
My husband died a long time ago. Life is full of pain. But there is also love and beauty.
What am I gonna do now?
Be grateful that for the first time, you see your life clearly.
Sure.
Perhaps you could help somebody. Helping makes you really happy.
But I still don't believe in nothing.
Often, neither do I.
Huh?
But then I meet someone like you, and everything makes sense.
You're too smart for me, sister. I guess I'm afraid.
There is nothing to be afraid of, Mr. Morgan. Take a gamble that love exists and do a loving act.
All aboard!
That single line is incredibly significant because it directly challenges the older gaming idea that masculine strength means emotional silence. Arthur is not screaming, fighting, or trying to dominate anyone in this moment. Instead, he's confronting his morality honestly and allowing himself to express fear openly. Sister Calderon does not treat his vulnerability as weakness, and the game itself frames the moment with immense emotional weight and dignity. Arthur's masculinity is not diminished because he admits fear. If anything, the scene suggests the opposite. It takes far more strength for Arthur to confront his emotions truthfully than it does for him to fight another enemy. The scene completely redefines what courage looks like. Courage is no longer about violence or intimidation, but about emotional honesty and self-reflection. These conversations are also important because Sister Calderon becomes one of the few people who encourages Arthur to see himself as more than the violence he has committed. Throughout his life, Arthur has become conditioned to believe his values come from loyalty, survival, and toughness. He sees himself as a criminal and a killer first, and for much of the story, he believes redemption is impossible for someone like him. Sister Calderon challenges this mindset by encouraging compassion, forgiveness, and personal growth. Arthur slowly begins to understand that masculinity does not have to be rooted in domination or aggression. His later actions in the story, helping John escape, protecting innocent people, trying to make amends for his past, reflect this emotional transformation. He begins defining strength through sacrifice and kindness rather than power. What makes these scenes so impactful is that they present vulnerability as deeply masculine rather than opposing masculinity altogether. Arthur remains physically strong, capable, and resilient throughout the game, but the story ultimately suggests those qualities mean very little without emotional maturity and empathy. His conversations with Sister Calderon represent a complete rejection of toxic masculine ideals that tell men to suppress fear, hide emotion, and carry suffering alone. Instead, the game argues that true masculinity comes from accountability and compassion, and the willingness to confront your pain without turning it into hatred or violence. For many players, these moments felt so powerful because they showed a male protagonist expressing emotional vulnerability without losing dignity, without losing respect or strength. After this arc, Arthur comforts people, protects vulnerable strangers, reflects on his regrets, and gradually accepts responsibility for the harm he has caused throughout his life. Unlike toxic masculine characters who suppress guilt or redirect pain into anger, Arthur confronts his morality and emotional suffering directly. Even though he remains dangerous and capable, his true strength comes from his humanity. He represents a form of masculinity built around sacrifice, self-reflection, and emotional maturity. For many players, Arthur felt deeply authentic because he proved that masculine strength and emotional openness are not opposites. His story suggests that being a man is not about appearing invincible, but about confronting your flaws honestly and still choosing kindness despite the pain. Ultimately, at the end of this video, I don't mean to look down upon anybody who sees these type of power fantasies as fun games. I do too. What I'm saying is when you have a majority of children playing these games, showing them that these toxic masculine strengths or traits are the only way to be is something that is inherently not good. It's something that shows these children that you should not show your emotions, that you should bury them deep down, and you should suppress everything that comes into you. At the end of the day, if you're going to get anything from this video, don't be like Duke Nukem. Don't be like Trevor from GTA 5. I know those are a bit hyperbolic type of examples, but they are still examples nonetheless. Be like Kratos. Be like Arthur Morgan. Feel your emotions. Let them be seen. Talk to people. Be emotionally open. Don't repress anything because you think you will be seen as less masculine. You can feel just like anybody else. Thank you so much for watching.